The loss of Kherson strikes at the core of the story Moscow has been telling since the beginning of the invasion. From the earliest days of the war, Russian officials projected certainty. They framed their advance not as a gamble, but as an unstoppable process, one that would unfold according to plan and end with permanent territorial change. Kherson became a central symbol of that claim. It was the first major Ukrainian city to fall, and it was presented as proof that resistance was futile and that time favored the occupying force. When that city slipped out of Russian control, it didn't just change the map, it exposed the fragility of the narrative itself. For months, Kherson was treated as irreversible. Russian authorities spoke in absolutes, insisting that the region had been fully integrated and would never return to Ukraine. Administrative systems were imposed, new governance structures announced, and public messaging repeated the same theme. This was settled, finished, beyond debate. That kind of language is not accidental. It is designed to project dominance and discourage resistance by convincing both civilians and opponents that opposing power is pointless. When such certainty collapses, the damage goes far beyond a single battlefield loss. What makes this moment so significant is the contradiction it creates. An occupying force can survive setbacks if it maintains credibility, but credibility depends on consistency. When a government declares something permanent and then reverses course under pressure, it invites scrutiny. People begin to question what else might be exaggerated, overstated, or simply untrue. Kherson's loss forces that question into the open, not just for foreign observers, but for domestic audiences who have been told this operation was controlled and successful. This is how inevitability breaks, not in one dramatic moment, but through accumulated contradictions. Kherson represented certainty, and losing it introduces doubt. Doubt spreads quickly. It affects soldiers who wonder whether sacrifices are leading anywhere. It affects civilians in occupied areas who reassess their risks. It affects allies and adversaries who recalibrate their assumptions. Once inevitability dissolves, every claim must stand on evidence rather than assertion. The strategic consequences are real, but the narrative consequences may be more lasting. Modern conflicts are fought not only with weapons, but with stories. Stories about strength, endurance, and resolve. Kherson was meant to anchor one of those stories. Its fall replaces confidence with questions and transforms what was once framed as a forward march into a defensive struggle. That shift matters because wars are often decided when belief erodes faster than resources. By losing Kherson, Moscow loses more than territory. It loses the ability to convincingly argue that outcomes are predetermined. The war no longer looks like a one-way process moving toward inevitable success. It looks contested, uncertain, and vulnerable to reversal. And once that perception takes hold, it is nearly impossible to reclaim. The impact of losing Kherson extends far beyond maps and military diagrams because wars are fought in the minds of people as much as they are fought on the ground. Control over territory matters, but control over perception can matter even more. When a city that was loudly presented as secure and permanent is suddenly abandoned, the psychological shock reverberates through every layer of the conflict. It alters how soldiers understand their mission, how civilians assess their safety, and how observers judge the balance of power. For the Russian military, the loss carries a heavy moral weight. Soldiers were told they were defending land that was now unquestionably theirs, land that had been formally claimed and publicly declared non-negotiable. When those same soldiers are ordered to withdraw, the message becomes deeply confusing. Sacrifice starts to feel disconnected from purpose. Confidence in leadership weakens and uncertainty creeps in. In prolonged conflicts, morale is not built on slogans, but on belief that objectives are clear and achievable. Kherson's fall disrupts that belief. The psychological impact is just as profound among civilians in occupied regions. Occupation depends on fear and the appearance of permanence. When people believe control is temporary, cooperation evaporates. Information flows change. Resistance becomes less risky and more rational. The loss of Kherson sends a signal to every occupied town and city that the occupying force can be pushed back. That signal cannot be easily undone, and it undermines the psychological foundation required to sustain long-term control. Inside Russia, the blow is equally damaging. This war has been framed as carefully managed, justified, and largely successful. The public has been shielded from many of the realities of the battlefield, But some facts cannot be hidden. A regional capital that was celebrated as a lasting achievement is no longer under control. That kind of reversal forces uncomfortable questions. If this was supposed to be permanent, what else might be temporary? If this was supposed to be success, what does failure look like? Authoritarian systems rely heavily on the perception of strength. Strength reassures supporters, discourages dissent, and deters challenges. When that perception cracks, the system becomes more brittle. Kherson's loss adds to existing strains. Mobilization confusion, reports of equipment shortages, and growing fatigue. Each on its own might be manageable. Together, they create a psychological environment where confidence drains faster than it can be restored. Internationally, the message is unmistakable. The image of Russian invulnerability takes another hit, while confidence in Ukraine's resilience grows. Allies who might have hesitated now see evidence that sustained support produces results. Adversaries reassess risks. Neutral observers revise expectations. In modern warfare, perception shapes policy decisions, and Kherson reshapes those perceptions in ways that favor Ukraine. This is why the loss of Kherson cannot be measured only in kilometers or supply routes. It represents a shift in belief. Once belief changes, behavior follows. And in war, that shift can be as decisive as any military maneuver. What makes the retreat from Kherson particularly damaging is not simply that territory was lost, but that it was lost after being framed as untouchable. For months, Russian officials spoke about Kherson in absolute terms. The language was definitive, designed to remove doubt and signal permanence. There was no suggestion of contingency, no acknowledgement that control might be challenged. By declaring the city non-negotiable, the leadership tied its credibility directly to its ability to hold that ground. When the withdrawal came, it exposed a gap between declared intent and actual capability. This is the danger of overpromising in wartime. Military operations are inherently uncertain, but political messaging often ignores that reality in favor of projecting confidence. In Kherson, that projection went too far. Referendums were staged, legal frameworks were announced, and symbolic gestures were made to suggest finality. These actions were meant to lock in a sense of inevitability, both for domestic audiences and for the international community. Instead, they amplified the consequences of failure. A quiet tactical adjustment might have been framed as flexibility. A retreat from what was declared permanent can only be seen as defeat. The nature of the withdrawal itself reinforces this perception. Russian forces did not leave Kherson because they chose to reposition for advantage. They left because sustained pressure made holding the city untenable. Supply lines were degraded, crossings became vulnerable, and the cost of staying exceeded the capacity to defend. When an army is forced to retreat under those conditions, it is not exercising control, it is responding to constraints. That distinction matters, especially when earlier messaging insisted there were no constraints at all. This moment also reveals the tension between political goals and military realities. Political leadership sought symbolic victories that could be presented as irreversible achievements. The military, however, was operating within practical limits. As those limits were reached, the gap between symbolism and reality became impossible to hide. Kherson is where that gap finally collapsed into public view. The result is not just embarrassment, but a loss of trust in future declarations. For soldiers on the ground, this creates a corrosive dynamic. Being ordered to defend territory declared sacred, only to later abandon it, undermines faith in strategic direction. It suggests that decisions are driven more by image than by achievable objectives. Over time, that perception erodes discipline and willingness to endure hardship. An army can absorb losses, but it struggles to absorb contradictions. On the global stage, the retreat reframes how Russian statements are interpreted. When leaders assert that something is non-negotiable, observers now have evidence to question that claim. Future declarations will be weighed against the memory of Kherson. This weakens deterrence and bargaining power because credibility once lost is difficult to restore. Kherson's retreat stands as a case study in how forced acknowledgement of failure can be more damaging than the failure itself. The city was not just lost. The certainty surrounding it was dismantled. And in war, certainty is often a weapon in its own right. The recapture of Kherson illustrates how effectiveness in modern warfare often comes not from dramatic advances, but from sustained, disciplined strategy. Rather than relying on sudden offensives designed for spectacle, Ukrainian forces focused on shaping the battlefield over time. This approach emphasized patience, coordination, and precision, gradually eroding the opponent's ability to function. Kherson did not fall because of a single decisive clash, but because the conditions required to defend it were systematically dismantled. Central to this strategy was the targeting of logistics and command infrastructure. Bridges, supply routes, and ammunition depots were placed under consistent pressure, forcing Russian forces into a reactive posture. When an army cannot reliably move fuel, food, or reinforcements, even well-fortified positions become liabilities. The west bank of the Dnipro River turned from an asset into a trap. Every resupply effort became riskier, every decision more constrained. Over time, the choice shifted from holding ground to avoiding catastrophic losses. This methodical approach reflects a broader understanding of how power is sustained in war. Control is not just about occupying space, it is about maintaining the systems that support that occupation. By degrading those systems, Ukrainian forces reduced the need for costly frontal assaults. Instead of confronting strength directly, they weakened it indirectly, allowing pressure to accumulate until withdrawal became the only viable option. This is warfare aimed at endurance rather than immediacy, and its effectiveness lies in its restraint. The role of intelligence and coordination cannot be overstated. Precision strikes depend on accurate information, timing, and communication. Ukrainian operations demonstrated an ability to integrate intelligence with battlefield decisions in near real time. This reduced waste, limited civilian harm, and maximized impact. The result was not only tactical success, but strategic clarity. Each action served a broader objective, reinforcing the sense that the campaign was guided by long-term planning rather than short-term impulse. Equally important is what this approach signals to allies and partners. Sustained support, training, intelligence sharing, and defensive assistance was translated into measurable results. Kherson stands as evidence that external backing, when paired with coherent strategy, can alter outcomes without escalating recklessness. This reinforces confidence among supporters that their involvement is not symbolic, but consequential. In contrast, the withdrawal highlights the limitations of an approach reliant on territorial grabs without secure foundations. Occupying space without ensuring supply resilience creates vulnerabilities that can be exploited over time. The fall of Kherson underscores that modern conflicts reward adaptability, coordination, and patience more than brute force. What emerges from this is a lesson about how wars are increasingly won. Success is built through accumulation rather than spectacle, through consistency rather than surprise. Kherson became a turning point not because it was taken quickly, but because it was reclaimed deliberately. That deliberateness is what makes the outcome so instructive and so difficult to reverse. The loss of Kherson sends a powerful and destabilizing signal to every territory still under Russian occupation. Control in such regions depends not only on military presence, but on the belief that the occupying force will remain indefinitely. When that belief collapses, the entire structure of occupation becomes fragile. Kherson demonstrates that Russian control can be reversed, and that realization fundamentally alters the calculations of both civilians and local authorities living under occupation. In occupied areas, fear has been one of the primary tools of control. Fear of punishment, fear of abandonment, fear that resistance will lead only to suffering with no chance of success. Kherson disrupts that fear-based equilibrium. When a major city once portrayed as permanently absorbed is reclaimed, it reframes resistance as a viable option rather than a hopeless gamble. People begin to reassess risks. Acts of quiet non-cooperation become more common. Information flows shift. Even small changes in behavior can compound, making occupation far more costly to sustain. Local collaborators face a sudden and uncomfortable reality as well. Many cooperated because they believed Russian control would last and that aligning with power was the safest choice. Kherson's fall undermines that assumption. The possibility of accountability becomes real. As a result, loyalty becomes conditional, transactional, and unreliable. An occupying force cannot function effectively when it must constantly question the reliability of those administering daily governance on its behalf. The effect extends to partisan activity. When people believe liberation is possible, underground networks gain momentum. Intelligence becomes easier to gather. Sabotage becomes more frequent and more effective. Kherson acts as proof of concept that patience can yield results. It validates long-term resistance strategies that rely on survival, information sharing, and timing, rather than open confrontation. That validation cannot be erased once it takes hold. For the occupying military, this creates a multiplying problem. More troops are required not just to fight on front lines, but to police the rear. Supply routes must be guarded more heavily. Resources are diverted to internal security rather than offensive operations. Each occupied region becomes a drain rather than an asset. Kherson's loss accelerates this dynamic by demonstrating that even heavily invested territory is vulnerable. Psychologically, the message is corrosive. Occupation thrives on the appearance of permanence. Once that illusion is broken, maintaining order requires increasing force, which in turn breeds more resentment and resistance. This cycle is difficult to sustain, especially in a prolonged conflict with limited manpower and resources. Kherson therefore becomes more than a single defeat. It becomes a warning. It tells every occupied city that time and pressure can work in their favor. It tells occupying forces that every kilometer held is now contested not just militarily, but psychologically. That shift makes long-term control vastly more unstable and far more expensive to maintain. Kherson represents a moment where the way this war is understood begins to change. For much of the conflict, assessments were shaped by projections. How much territory might be taken, how long one side could endure, how overwhelming power was assumed to be. These conversations often relied on abstractions rather than outcomes. The loss of Kherson shifts that framework. It introduces a concrete measure of success and failure that cannot be explained away by promises or future intentions. What matters now is not what is claimed, but what can actually be held. This shift is significant because it alters expectations on all sides. When a war is framed around momentum and inevitability, setbacks can be dismissed as temporary. But when attention turns to defensibility and sustainability, every position becomes subject to scrutiny. Kherson forces that scrutiny into the open. It demonstrates that control requires constant reinforcement, reliable logistics, and credible local authority. Without those elements, even strategically important territory becomes vulnerable over time. For Ukraine, this change reinforces a strategy grounded in measurable progress. Rather than chasing symbolic victories, the focus becomes on degrading the opponent's ability to sustain occupation. Each reclaimed area is not just a morale boost, but evidence of a functioning approach. This clarity matters because it aligns military effort with achievable goals. It also provides a framework for communicating success to domestic and international audiences without exaggeration. For Russia, the implications are more severe. The narrative of endurance and gradual consolidation is replaced by a harsher question. Where can forces realistically remain without suffering unacceptable losses? This reframing narrows options. It turns expansion into liability and forces prioritization under pressure. As resources thin and fronts stretch, holding territory becomes a test rather than an assumption. Kherson is the first major answer to that test, and it is not a reassuring one. Internationally, this shift influences policy decisions. Governments weighing continued support look for evidence that assistance translates into outcomes. Kherson provides that evidence. It shows that sustained backing can produce durable results rather than endless stalemate. At the same time, it signals that occupation is not static. Lines on the map are not fixed, and investments in defense can yield tangible change. This moment also reframes how future developments will be judged. Announcements, declarations, and symbolic gestures carry less weight. What counts is endurance under pressure. Each territory held will be evaluated based on supply resilience, local stability, and the ability to withstand sustained challenge. This standard is unforgiving, but it is clear. Kherson does not resolve the conflict, but it establishes a new metric. The war moves from theory to evidence, from projection to proof. Once that transition occurs, it becomes difficult to reverse. Outcomes speak louder than intentions, and Kherson speaks clearly.